We're in Psalm 59, and we are picking it up in about verse 10. Yesterday, we talked about David relying on God's strength, waiting on God, actively dependent, God being his defender. Now, how could God's strength be available to David? How could God be accessible to David? And how could God come to the position of being a defender, an advocate for David? Well, it's in the next verse, verse 10. The God of my mercy shall prevent me. God shall let me see my desire upon mine enemies. Let me keep reading for a minute. We'll come back to verse 10. Slay them not, lest my people forget. Scatter them by thy power and bring them down, O Lord, our shield. For the sin of their mouth and the words of their lips, let them even be taken in their pride. And for cursing and lying which they speak, consume them in wrath, consume them, that they may not be. And let them know that God ruleth in Jacob unto the ends of the earth. Selah. Now, 4 really great verses. But let's go back to verse 10. The God of my mercy. Here it is. I cannot ever relate to God on the basis of my performance or my goodness or my achievements. No, I'm a sinner. I'm imperfect, and I deserve the justice and wrath of God. But God is a defender. He is a promise keeper. He is a compassion giver. He's a mercy shower. And so he was personified in the body and person of Jesus Christ, and he took on a life of mercy and compassion, and then he went to the cross and he shed his blood and died the death my sin deserves so that he could offer me mercy. Okay? Ancient Israel had a Ark of the Covenant. It was an object that represented figuratively the presence of God among them as God's people. Well, the top of the ark was called the mercy seat. And the priest would sacrifice the lamb, bring the blood once a year on the Day of Atonement into the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum where the presence of God was with but separate from men. And he would present the blood of that lamb on the mercy seat. So God's mercy was the only way that man could come to God and God could be with man and that the two could meet. But mercy was only available by the shedding of the blood of a perfect lamb. Well, Jesus became the perfect lamb. And our guilt and shame was put on him. His blood was shed, presented at the mercy seat of God, and God's mercy is now available to all of us. He is the God of our mercy. The verse continues and says, that God will prevent me. Now, that's a word we don't use the same today as it's used here, but it simply means to proceed or to go before. So the God of my mercy walks before me. There's not a circumstance you face today or tomorrow or the next day that God hasn't already walked ahead of you, as what David says in verse 11, your shield. A wall of defense in front of you. So if it comes to you, it already came through him. It has his permission, and he walks with you before you. He's there before you ever got there. He's going to walk you through it, and he'll be there with you when it's all over, because David says, God shall let me see my desire upon mine enemies. He proceeds in verse 11 and 12 and 13, as we read, to pray for God to bring about justice, to execute vengeance, righteous justice and victory. He's praying that God will see the victory over his enemies and consume them. He says in verse 11, don't just slay them. Make them a public example. Everybody needs to see that God triumphs, that God wins, and that when you take on God, you always lose. Well, my friend, I want to park it here and just remind you, and I want to let you go a little bit early today, that you belong, if you've come to God through Jesus, you belong to a God of mercy, and he prevents you. He walks in front of you. He precedes you in every circumstance you'll face today. Hey, have a great Thursday, and know he walks before you. I'll see you tomorrow.